Howdy, everybody. Today we're going to talk about the file-based realm. So Elasticsearch offers multiple authentication realms, which allow you to log into your cluster. They allow two internal authentication realms. One's called native, which backs up to the .security alias as an actual index in your cluster, and the other one's called file. So file-based authentication is reserved as kind of a fallback recovery realm that when all of your other authentication methods experience errors, you can still get in order to administrate and recover your cluster. So an example of when this would happen is that .security7 index. If, for example, the nodes that it's hosted on experience storage or host level issues and they exit the cluster and that index becomes red, then all of the underscore security API endpoints aren't going to work. So that includes built-in users, that includes custom roles and role mappings. So especially because it includes role mappings, that means authentication methods across the board could be experiencing issues, in which case you'll also find that your Kibana sessions likely get logged out, and Kibana even could get to the point that it's starting to error, Kibana server is not yet ready, just because that .security index is a Kibana dependency. So at this point, as an administrator, you would need to be recovering your cluster from the node and or API. And then afterwards, we can get the rest of it back up and running. But first things first, we need to get an authenticated session in order to recover our cluster. So for today's demonstration, I'm just going to do a locally hosted cluster. As you scroll through this, I only did all of the default MAC options, didn't change anything. And so for this cluster, we have over here this one node, and it's running over here on my first tab, all of my previous tests. So for our purposes, the story that we'll generate is we say, I have my Elasticsearch built-in user and its password that I know in the past has been working, but right now, when I attempt to use it, it's going to 401 authentication error on me, and it's going to say unable to authenticate user Elastic. So in general, I would find that scary. I would find that unexpected, which is a pretty good indicator that we need to come use the file-based user authentication doc. So this doc ends up calling out, if you're on an older version of Elasticsearch, you may need to set up these settings, but on more recent versions, they are implicitly configured, so you don't need to set this up. If you do need to set this setting on older versions, you'll also need to restart the node. Now, a huge caveat for when we're working on file-based realm is that it's assuming the same privileges of how Elasticsearch is running. And so it's only allowing the configuration on that current node. It does not apply on a cluster level. So the implication of that is that when we're editing, if we want changes to reflect across the entire cluster, we would need to edit the node configurations across the entire cluster. Or secondly, and what we'll focus on today, is that in order to get the API responsive again, we are going to direct our API traffic, particularly to that node localhost, rather than like if we had some proxy in front or load balancer in front. That's not going to work for the purposes of this file run. So again, if on older versions, you do need to configure the setting manually, which recent versions have it implicit, just kindly make sure to know that you will need to restart that node for it to take effect. If that is you, we recommend doing it on a not data node if possible and a master eligible but not currently elected master if possible. But for recent versions, it's enabled by default, making things nice, smooth, and easy. The reason for is because afterwards, the doc ends up going into like, now you need to add a user and you need to add roles for it potentially that, again, only apply when traffic's directed to that particular node. This next ballpark about user and user roles do not require node restarts. They apply automatically. I think it's like maybe up to a 5-second delay. So this doc ends up going through, if you're going to write that out manually, I don't do things manually. We're just going to use the Elasticsearch users tool. And so this ends up telling you that under bin Elasticsearch users, we can add a user with its username, password, and its role. So for our purposes today, we're just going to confirm that bin directory does not currently have any users, and then I'm going to add an admin user that has role superuser. And just because this is a demo, I'm putting the password at change me, but obviously you might want something a little harder to guess than that default. Okay, so here we have the super user role. So now if I hit up, I should be able to put in my new admin, change me, and I should be able to authenticate. Done, we did it. If you're in the middle of a production outage because of a security authentication block, you just got back into your cluster. That was really easy. But now that I'm into my cluster, now I'm going to ask myself, like, hey, like, what's going on? Like, why can't that password that I know has worked before, like, why isn't it working anymore? So I'm going to look at the .security index. I'm not going to. One second. Blah, blah, cat indices, .security. Oh, it's not JQ. That's funny. Okay. So here we see, for the purposes of my demo, I force closed that index, and so it cannot receive any of the search traffic. And so we would want to open that index. Now, just calling out, for a lot of people, at this point, what you would actually encounter is that the index would be red because the node left the cluster that was hosting that data. If you can't get the node back into cluster, it's going to be red, it's going to be open, it's going to be unrecoverable without an Elasticsearch official snapshot. So if you're in that bucket, you actually are okay with the index being closed and can move on with the current credentials that you have in order to snapshot restore that feature state. So that's option number one, or example number one. Example number two might be you don't have an Elasticsearch snapshot backup already, and you want to move on to deleting this index. If we right now say that we want to delete this index, spoiler, it's not going to work, we're going to receive an error that says, like, hey, like, this is, like, you're a super user, but you're not a super user with extra security privileges. And so it's going to say, like, you don't have allow restricted privileges against this index. That's just a protection. Like, if you were in your database doing a delete star for all indices, you wouldn't want to affect the security index on accident. So if hypothetically we're in example two, where we want to delete that index so that when we restart the node, it creates a generic .security index for us, we need to escalate our privileges in order to resolve that. In the same spirit of my literal example, which again is just a demo example, because that index is closed, I again need to escalate privileges in order to try to open that index. So here, if I say I want to open, it's just going to again give me a, hey, you're unauthorized. So this is the exact same ballpark. This is that we need a super user role plus. And in particular, if we look at that roles .yaml, these settings up here are basically the super user role. And then the caveat of where we need to expand it is we need to have allow restricted indices as true. So for what we did earlier, we're just going to delete that admin user. And then right after, we're going to add it again, except this time we're going to give it that super duper user role. You can call that role whatever you want, but I think that's a fun name. And then if we come and list our users, here we will now see that our, called it super admin. Yeah, I did. Our super admin has role super duper user. So again, just making sure that we can authenticate super admin. Can have an authenticated session, in which case afterwards, super admin can post open that index just as we desired. So as soon as we've been able to do that, we should be able to circle all the way back to that original error that we had that said that our Elastic user could not API curl the cluster without 401 airing. We just resolved that. So at this point, if we, from that user, wanted to do authenticate, we wanted to do all of the various underscore security, I don't remember what it's called right now. Yeah, underscore authenticate. All of the underscore security API endpoints are going to be available now so that we can actually see those different settings. At this point, we would say we have recovered the cluster security so that we can access it. So as cleanup, again, I just barely showed that example command. We can go and say super admin. We can say bin Elasticsearch utils user delete, remove out that admin if we don't want it sitting around. And then user list, we can see that it is now removed from the cluster. Again, those settings are going to take effect pretty instantaneously, potentially that 5-second delay. So now if we went to try to curl with that super user admin, here we're just saying, hey, unable to authenticate. So at this point, we just barely demonstrated file-based user authentication as a fallback recovery option in order to get the ability to securely authenticate to the cluster backup. So with that, huzzah, happy, easy, quick, we're back in our cluster. Thanks. Have a great one all.